Hey, all right, Daily Riders. Zack here with RevZilla, and welcome to another episode. Our guest for the ride today is the Triumph Speed 400. That is a liquid-cooled single-cylinder engine with retro styling and modern features along the lines of what has come to define Triumph over the past 10 to 20 years. There's lots to talk about here, I think we can agree. Not least of which, this machine adds to a growing constellation of bikes that are built by European brands in India. So it'll be interesting to see how it stacks up against KTMs and BMWs, etc. But also, I mean, what's it like to ride to work? How does it feel on the road? Does it feel like a Triumph? Does it feel like a good bike? All that and more coming up. Okie dokie, everybody. Before we get going here on the Speed 400 Daily Rider, a quick reminder that this episode is brought to you by RevZilla, not just a YouTube channel, but also an e-commerce platform that sells accessories and apparel for you and parts for your motorcycle. It's also more than that. It's a community. That's the way we like to think about it anyway. That's why we make this show, the shop manual with Harry Henning, the High Side, Low Side podcast. Sometimes we even give stuff away. Like this Speed 400, actually. Depending on when you're watching this video, there is a live sweepstakes where you could win a Triumph Speed 400 or Scrambler 400X to commemorate the one-year anniversary of Spurgeon and I riding these two Triumph 400s to the tallest motorable road in the world. So, next time you watch a Daily Rider or a Shop Manual or High Side, Low Side podcast or a CTXP adventure, just keep that in mind. We hope that you enjoy all this content and you'll shop with us when you can. In the meantime, thanks for watching. Okay, everybody, let's start with the engine, as we often do. This is a 398cc TR series single-cylinder liquid-cooled engine. It is, of course, breaking from much of the recent tradition of Triumph, which historically makes twin and three-cylinder motorcycles. Of course, Triumph made singles way back when. It's a break-in tradition, but of course you can see the resemblance that they're going for, the style and shape of the case, the contrast cut in the cylinder head. It's an understandable sort of homage to the larger siblings, and of course we'll talk more about how it works as we ride. A couple other things to call out here. The typical Triumph styling, which I called out when I did the Scrambler 400X Daily Rider as well. This nice sweep to the pipe here. When you stand back, it looks like a nice simple exhaust system. Of course, if you look closer, you can see this little bread box and all the sort of hardware and stuff underneath here to meet emission standards and blah, blah, blah. Steel tube frame, pretty basic. It does have a removable subframe, which I think is kind of nice, if for no other reason than, you know, tips over, gets bent or gets damaged somehow. You can replace that instead of the bike perhaps getting totaled. Other than that, pretty basic hardware. It's cast aluminum swing arm, I believe, which is something that Triumph is rather proud of because some of the other motorcycles in the class have historically not had a part that's quite as high quality as that, so that's sort of fair to call out. And aside from that, you got your 17-inch wheels with Metzler rubber. Pretty basic motorcycle other than that, right? It's a gas tank, it's a seat, foot pegs, handlebar. I don't know what else we need to call out right now, really. Upside down fork, basic single shock. That's one way that it differentiates itself actually from some of the other modern classics in Triumph's lineup, which many of them have twin shocks because of the aesthetic and whatnot. This is a slightly more modern design with the shock tucked up here underneath the seat. And it has preload adjustment, I believe, but I don't think there's any damping adjustment. If I'm wrong about that, I apologize, Triumph. But I think it's just preload. Anyway, the point is, pretty basic motorcycle in general. Kind of sharp, I think. Let's take it for a ride, shall we? That's why you're here. I know, I get it. We'll fire up this analog digital hybrid dash here and fire the sucker up. And you're going to hear a little single cylinder pitter patter. Vroom vroom. Okay, we've got 398 cc's of Triumph single cylinder power. We've got retro looks. I got my leather jacket on, looking cool, I hope. Let's take it for a spin. Ride to work, shall we? Off we go. Alrighty, now that we're rolling, we can talk about some specs. And by gosh, I realized right off the bat, I forgot to talk about the price. $5,000, $49.95, I believe, is the asking price for the Speed 400. Other specs you will find a 31.1 inch seat height, which as I get this green light you can see a little bit of bend in my leg, maybe a little taller than you were expecting. We'll talk more about that later. With the 3.4 gallon tank, I believe, all the way full on the Daily Rider scales, it weighed in at 384 pounds. And that 398cc single makes 40 horsepower, just about on the nose, claimed from Triumph. Is that all the specs? I think that might be all of them. Well, I hope it's all of them because I'm done talking about specs for now. But a couple things I did want to call out. One, in my Delhi ride, excuse me, in India, where I rode the Scrambler 400X across Delhi, India, I said something like, I thought the claimed weight from Triumph seemed very low. I thought that it would weigh in closer to 400 pounds, especially the Scrambler. I have not put the Scrambler on the scales here, but this is quite a bit lighter, and someone pointed out quite astutely that the bikes we rode in India do have some extra gear on there. Like they had some crash guards, they had a sari guard for the passenger, and all that probably weighed up to, you know, who knows, what, 6 pounds, 10 pounds, something like that. So that might have contributed to me feeling like that bike was a little bit heavier. I do think in general that the Speed 400 feels lighter than the Scrambler anyway, both from a sort of steering touch standpoint, which we'll talk about later, and just like coming off the kickstand. It's a little lower, it's got a smaller front wheel, it just is a little bit daintier, and I don't say that in a disparaging way, it's just, it's a little bit more trim. It also, I should say, feels a lot more upright than I remember Spurgeon's bike being in India when I rode it. The handlebar has more rise than I remember, and you sort of sit more upright. The foot pegs are a little bit farther forward than I remember. I think in general that's a good thing. If you're expecting it to feel, you know, particularly sporty because of the name, because of the suggestion, it's not, I don't think. I think a more accurate description of it might have been to call it a Bonneville 400, and that's sort of how it feels, even if that's not exactly how it looks. It's super neutral, and I think the position that the rider's placed in the saddle is really quite agreeable. As for the seat itself, I'd like to address that as we're on the highway now. That's a good time to talk about it because I think it's wider and softer and cushier, more comfortable than I thought it was going to be or remembered it from riding it in India. Though I think it might be too soft as we're on the freeway here. I will tell you that after an hour, 2 hours, probably 2 hours in the saddle, for me, I got a little tired of the seat, and I think it might be because I weigh 200 pounds and I'm just sort of blowing through the foam. If you're a smaller, lighter rider, you might find it to be a little better, but as usual, seats are very subjective. Another thing I commented on when I rode the Scrambler 400X in India was that I thought that at 55, 60 miles an hour, the bike was very comfortable, and if you tried to ride it at 70 or 80 miles an hour, it might feel kind of strained. And as I've been riding this bike around in Southern California here, I can confirm that 80 miles an hour does feel a little strained. In the same way that I made comments about the Duke 390 sweating a little bit, I feel the same way about BMW G310 models. You get a single cylinder engine, even if it's modern and liquid cooled, 400cc single that's spinning 6,000, 8,000 RPM on the freeway, sometimes more than that. It's gonna get a little vibey and like, not really chaotic, but like it's gonna tingle with some energy that is not always flattering. And this is kind of the cusp for me right here. We're showing 70 miles an hour, which I think is a little generous. I think we're probably going more like 60 or 65. I think this Speedo is a little optimistic. But yeah, 65, 70 is sort of the upper edge of where I feel like the bike is happy, if you will. And now we're going 55, 60, and this is like, the mirrors are smooth, the engine's pretty smooth, it just feels really nice at this speed, which is more like how highways work in India, in my experience. And for that reason, I think I'd probably gear this bike up. We'll experiment with leaving stop signs in second gear a little later on. But yeah, I think that the engine deserves to have slightly taller gearing, and you wouldn't have the same kind of roll-on power in sixth gear like you do right now, but it would be more comfortable at these speeds, in my opinion. As for gas mileage, I'm realizing that I forgot to do the calculation. I'm sorry, that's really annoying and dumb. I don't like it. I'm gonna put my average on screen right now so you have that data. In the meantime, I'd like to call out another thing that I found really interesting about this bike, which is that it has instant fuel economy right here. And you'll see that it's reading 60 miles per gallon flat right now. And if I roll off the throttle, it still reads 60 miles to the gallon. And that's because in this motorcycle anyway, the software has not been updated and it won't show instant fuel mileage above 60 miles to the gallon. Not really that big a deal for the motorcycle, if I'm being honest, but an odd kind of quirk or maybe flaw in the system, considering this motorcycle will often at any moment in time, especially going downhill on the freeway like this, be getting more than 60 miles per gallon, and that's not information that you're privy to because it maxes out at 60 or 100 kilometers an hour, I imagine. So if I get on the throttle and I ride the rear brake a little bit and I use some more gas, you can see it comes down here and starts giving us readings like 44 and 42 and so on and so forth. If I let off the back brake and just cruise along, I don't have any information. And I called it out for a couple reasons. One, because I think it's an interesting mistake to make. And two, because when I asked Triumph about this, Triumph said that this is a software update that is available for motorcycles and has been instituted in newer models. So if your bike does this, you ought to be able to get it fixed for what it's worth. 210 miles of range, though. That's something else I wanted to talk about. This bike's got pretty good legs. More fuel capacity than a Speed Twin 900, I believe, by a few tenths of a gallon. And yeah, it's not very thirsty. I got, I think, 190 miles out of one tank. And when Spurgeon and I rode him in India, we were riding him slower and getting better mileage, I think. And we got well over 200 miles on a couple tanks. Great range for a bike like this. And to finish out this conversation on the highway, I think you'll be pretty happy if you try to take this on a multi-day trip or some sort of, short tour or something like that. It doesn't have a ton of horsepower. It's not super fun on the highway with no wind protection and a small engine. I think it's cool that it's got pretty good range, I mentioned the mirrors once before already. This is where like 70, 75 miles an hour, they start to get a little buzzy. Below that, I think they're pretty good. They're not exactly the right shape. Of course, if it was a little more trapezoidal and had a little wing sticking out over here, I'd be able to see more stuff behind me, but I get it. Classic looking bike, round mirrors. They're pretty good in general, especially for a $5,000 bike. All right, into a little neighborhood here. I feel like the Speed 400's got potential to be pretty good at the old stop sign challenge. It's got a nice short first gear, first of all. Yeah. And it's just light and small. And that always helps with controlling the weight of the motorcycle with your body. And it's also just pretty direct. It doesn't have a lot of weight up high and a nice wide handlebar. Not a lot to distract you. The levers are not adjustable, which I like to call out because some other similarly sized motorcycles have adjustable levers, and I do think that that's a nice feature. I don't tend to care that much about how long levers are, but I'm an experienced motorcycle and I have I'm an experienced motorcyclist, that is, and I have reasonably sized hands, so like I don't care much about it. Adjustable levers are nice is the point. In general, I would say the manners of the Speed 400 are pretty good. I messed that one up too. I think I'm 2 for 4. Yeah, it's easy enough to use. The throttle control is direct and easy. There's not too much lash, just a little bit. If you're sort of like kind of ham-fisted with on-off gas, it's as many motorcycles suffer with. But basic cable clutch, and I feel like it's all pretty direct. One thing I would like to call out is gearing, which as I get this full stop in here, I'm just going to let the clutch out. Oh, we got a pickup truck behind us, so I'm going to pull over for just a second. And then I'm going to let the clutch out in first gear and let it idle. And we are going, a little bit above walking speed. Like, we're probably in the way in the bike lane. And this is sort of just an illustration of how low the bike is geared. Really geared for a parking lot, kind of. If you upshift to second gear and you go to merge into traffic, I think it's a perfectly reasonable first gear. Where second is. So just a quick illustration of my opinion of the gear ratios. I think you could probably go with a 1 tooth larger sprocket on the front, if it'll fit, that is, and be pretty happy with that. As I sit at this traffic light here, I'm reminded that I do get a bit of heat on my legs from this engine, maybe a little bit more than I would have expected. It's not a particularly warm day today, and I did notice a little bit of heat, especially when the cooling fan kicks on. don't think it's anything to really worry about, but surprised me a little bit because a bike this size, it's fairly under stress, doesn't make a ton of power. Noticing the heat at all, something that surprised me a little bit. So overall score for the Speed 400 in an urban suburban environment, it's got to be high. It's good. It's a good motorcycle. It's small, it's light, and it's direct, and doesn't have a lot of stuff hanging off it. It's a nice motorcycle, and I think that if you're going to ride it in situations like this, you're going to be really happy. One thing I meant to circle back to was the seat height, which in these, stop sign environments, if you're a shorter rider, a low seat height is handy, and 31.1 inches is not especially low for a bike of this engine size and price point. I noticed actually that it is an inch taller than the Speed Twin 900, its big sibling. And I think that's an interesting thing to call out. I think, if I had to guess, if I were a Triumph engineer, I might have said, well, a Speed Twin 900 weighs something like 100 pounds more than this bike. And so we really should try to make the seat height low because it weighs 480 pounds instead of 380 pounds, something like that. And if that's the case, I think that's fair. And ultimately, my point here is that if it feels a little bit tall to sit on and it looks a little tall on paper, I would encourage you to let yourself get used to it maybe, because it is such a small, light motorcycle, even if the seat is taller than you were expecting. And just like that, we're halfway through Lover's Lane. I got to get my passenger report in quickly here. I think the seat is, again, surprisingly plush and thick back in the passenger perch there. I think it's much more Bonneville than Speed, kind of, if that makes sense. It's in between the bigger bike's demeanor. So I think passenger will be pretty happy. Probably tired of the seat after a couple hours, but if you're doing a couple hour stints with a passenger on your Speed 400, then something tells me your buns are tougher than most. All right, into the twisty roads where the old Speed 400 ought to show its speed roots, theoretically, right? I think it's really fun on roads like this. The big thing is suspension refinement. There's not a lot of that. And ultimately, you don't need your suspension to be ultra fully adjustable, Öhlins, everything to enjoy a road like this, in my opinion. The suspension is budget for pretty obvious reasons. I just think the bike is really fun. The profile and attitude that it has when it changes direction is really nice. And as long as you're sort of smooth with your inputs and the road is fairly smooth, you'll have a blast. When you start hitting bumps in the middle of corners, especially sort of like long, slow undulations where you sort of would like to have a more refined damping schedule, like if you get kind of this thing going on for some reason, not that the bike does that by itself, but that's when you'll feel the suspension be a little soggy and a little loose. And at the same time, if you hit sharp stuff like a manhole cover like that, the fork can feel a little bit harsh. So the suspension is a weak point to a certain extent, but I really think only in part because the rest of the bike is kind of so enjoyable and good. All right, back onto surface streets here. Let's spin up this engine here for a second. Second gear. The rev limiter already. Oh, hey-oh, are we gonna catch this green light? We never catch this green. Oh, no, of course not. Okay, chance to test this Bybri caliper. Front brake here. Let's hoss on it. Yeah, jumped into the ABS. It's good strong brakes, I think. I think it's, as far as I can tell, it's basically the same setup. I wouldn't be surprised if it's the same part number as the caliper on the KTM 390 Duke and Aprilia RS457 that we tested recently. And yeah, braided lines and radial caliper, and I think it's got plenty of power. And also, again, no adjustable lever. It's sort of like, that feels like the weak link, right? Like I wouldn't be mad about a non-adjustable front brake lever on a $5,000 bike until all the other componentry is sort of like, seems pretty good. And then you're like, oh, I wish I had that. So, you know. Should we talk about the dash? No, I don't think so. I don't think we're going to talk about the dash because it's almost our turn. Here we go. We're going to talk about the dash later. Promise. Alley-oop. All right. Another stoplight just in time to talk about the dash like I promised you. It won't take very long. It's got a big analog speedo here that takes up most of the real estate. And then over on the right-hand side here, a little two-color LCD situation with the gear position indicator, a little tiny vertical bar tack there, and then a few pieces of data here that you can cycle through with this button on the left switch gear. So you can do 2 different trips, miles per gallon, range, traction control, controls here, which we'll talk about a little bit more later, and then a settings menu you can jump into with this single button, which just gets a little clunky and cumbersome. It's very simple. I like that it's elemental, and that's kind of part of the aura and mantra and vibe, if you will, of, you know, these Triumph Modern Classics. I think it suits the 400cc class pretty well, especially dressed up like this. I think it's nice. All right, off we go. At this point, you might be thinking that I've heaped quite a bit of praise on the Speed 400, but not a lot on the engine, and I would say that's true. You know, if someone said, should I buy a 400cc Triumph just for the engine, I think I would say no. I like the engine. I think that it feels a little more stately and a higher quality than the BMW G310. I think it feels more calm and lopey than the KTM 400s, 390s, 400s, whatever. And I think that's kind of a good thing, because if you remember my 390 Duke review, I just felt like that engine was a little bit chaotic and kind of flighty, and it does a high performance feel, certainly, but I didn't love it. I like this engine a little bit better. Still, ultimately, Triumph has some ad copy on its website about how, like, an unmistakable sound of ba-ba-ba-ba-ba, whatever. And, like, no. It's just a 400cc single. There's nothing special and creative or even particularly interesting about this engine. And I don't love that Triumph is trying to beat that drum, because it just isn't that. Sorry. I think it's pretty good, especially for the class, but unmistakable? I don't know. Okay, we're winding down on the main part of the ride here, which means we should address some of the questions that were brought up in the beginning. Like, does this feel like a Triumph? No, I don't think so. Not really. I think if you were figuratively blindfolded and asked to ride this bike and said, what brand is it? I would be really surprised if someone said, that's got a Triumph kind of feel. I just don't think it does. And I think that anyone who says that it does is closing their eyes too much, or they're too caught up in the way that it looks, because it does look like a Triumph, 100%. And that's worth something, but not the same as it feeling like a Triumph. Does it feel like a good motorcycle to get to work? Yeah, you know, I think it does. It doesn't feel as high quality as a European motorcycle that's made in Europe. And I know that sounds predictable or lazy for me to comment on it like that, but that's kind of how I feel. One of the things that Indian companies like Bajaj and others benefit from is the standard to which they are held by their European partners in making those motorcycles. I don't know very much about Bajaj, but I suspect that the motorcycles that are made for domestic markets or are made under their own terms are not quite as nice as ones that are made for KTM, for Triumph, for BMW, for Aprilia. That's my suspicion, and I think that that standard is a tide that's only going to lift all boats. So for now, I think that this does feel like a good motorcycle to get to work on. I think it's fun. I think it has a few little quirks and flaws and signs that it's made to a price point, but I like that it's not trying to be more than that, or trying to be too much. It's just trying to be a simple little motorcycle that looks cool, and I think ultimately it does that. All right, dirt road shortcut time. I would be remiss if I did not say, if you want to see this bike do some actual off-roading, you should watch Spurgeon ride it across India in our CTXP episode that came out last year. I think you might be surprised. But I'll do a little dirt road shortcut anyway. I'm going to leave traction control on initially, and we're going to see what happens. First gear is so flipping short, it's hard to... All right, second gear. I mean, it's pretty lenient. I'm surprised. ABS works pretty well in the dirt, even. I think that you could argue that this bike benefits from traction control, but I just don't think it needs it. Let's see. Let's shut off traction control and see if it'll hold, and then There we go. TTC off. And we'll punch it. I mean, even in like loose sand, it's just not very unruly. I get it, it has traction control because that's what bikes are supposed to have now and whatever. But this engine, more so than other small singles, like I said, has a relatively heavy flywheel and it isn't too excitable. And traction control off, you can have a great time more often than you're going to have a bad time, I think. All right, we're back out on the blacktop. Let's see if we can do a wheelie. Let's use my surrogate first gear, i.e. second gear. See how that works. Oh yeah, look at that. Whoa, okay. Came up a little quicker than I thought. Let's try again. I can do better. I didn't have it in me to shift. Not a lot of power. Not a wheelie monster. If you turn traction control off, you're not going to mousetrap yourself. But with a name like Speed in the name, a word like speed in the name, you like to see you can at least do a wheelie in second gear, aka first gear. Off we go. One last sprint home. All right, whether or not you can back it in, let's find out here. Non-adjustable ABS, but you can dump the clutch and get a nice little tail wag, which is kind of fun. I think shutting off rear ABS would be cool. I don't think you can do it on this bike. Again, if I'm wrong, I apologize, but the Scrambler has an off-road ABS mode. This bike does not, but you can still trick it into, oh jeez, that's a little sketchy. Yeah, don't practice backing in on this bike. It's not really the bike for that. I didn't really talk about the general kind of like agility or low speed parking lot manners of this bike, but they're good. It won't come as a huge surprise. I'm gonna go along this line here. We're gonna crank the bars to left, full lock feet up. Yeah, I mean, what is that, 1.6 maybe? Yeah, nice. As it should be with a small bike, especially a bike that you're liable to use around town. And there we have it, everybody. The old Speed 400. Dust on the tires from the dirt road shortcut. It's an awfully handsome little bike, I gotta say. One more listen to the engine here. Just sort of like a little bit slower to rev up and a little bit slower to come down off the revs than the 390 Duke from KTM, for example. And that's the kind of character I was talking about, you know. All right, time for Instagram questions. First one up here is from Two Wheels to Relax, who says, if you could rename the bike, what would you name it? Also, is the 6-speed welcome, as Triumph doesn't always include 6-speed on the 900 Retro Classics? So, a couple questions in there. If you could rename the bike, what would you name it? I think if this had a low exhaust and a slightly, more complete rear fender, you could easily just say, and maybe wire spoke wheels, which I granted, maybe all this stuff is expensive and I should be cautious suggesting that Triumph does all this because I don't understand the economics of blah, blah, blah. I think really, like I said, it feels more like a Bonneville 400, from the character of the engine to the ergonomics, the riding position. The line between Bonneville and Speed is is up for debate, and if anyone gets to control that, it's Triumph. So I kind of like the upswept muffler and the stubby rear fender, and maybe the cast wheels fit better with that sort of style of bike. If I was going to rename it, I think I might suggest that it was a little more relaxed and a little less sporty. But maybe that's not what they want. I don't know. As for the 6-speed gearbox, that is a good call out. I think the Speed Twin 900, I'm not sure which bikes exactly, but yeah, some of the 900cc parallel twins from Triumph only have 5-speed gearboxes. However, I would like to call out that those 5-speed gearboxes, in my opinion, are spaced beautifully. Really, really nice. Like, you don't even want a 6th gear because the setup of the transmission is so good. This transmission, I think, is a typical modern 6-speed box in so much as the gear ratios are kind of close together. And I don't think it leans on the dynamism of the engine as much as it could, considering I think this bike could get away with slightly taller gearing or slightly wider gear spacing. So yeah, is the 6-speed gearbox a nice feature to have? Sure. But if a 5-speed gearbox is done right, it's enough. Next question is from Bella B711, who asks, I'd love to hear your thoughts on what you think the next step up in power that rides and feels like this bike. Sometimes it seems to lack power on the highway travel. I love everything else about it. Interesting question. So, do you like the single-cylinder engine? And if that's what you like, then, something else that feels like this bike, you're going to be hemmed in a little bit, getting single cylinder engines that are bigger and more powerful, but also, kind of like as comfortable and share this style. I think more likely what you're going to want to do is upgrade to a parallel twin. You could do that via a Honda CB500F if you wanted to. My guess is that you're going to look at a CB500F and think, no, that looks like an alien trying to invade Earth. I want the classic round headlight and the teardrop tank and the style of this bike. And in that case, a pretty obvious step up would be a Triumph 900. And that's like not an accident, right? That's why Triumph is trying to build a gateway motorcycle. Another option, I think, would be a Royal Enfield parallel twin, INT 650. I thought that bike was a hoot. Not very refined suspension, similar, but also kind of handsome. And I think that engine is a big upgrade from this one. And it's going to be heavier and bigger, but it's also going to be more powerful and share that same kind of style. So that's sort of where my mind would go. There are also lots of other options out there. I'm sure the YouTube audience will chime in and help me out with some suggestions. Those would be my 3 most obvious upgrades. Last question here is from Lanky the Danky, who asks, as someone who's casually looking for a first bike, is this a good one to lust after? Okay. Interesting. Yeah, I think so. This is my opinion. This is how I feel. This is not based on reliability records. It's not based on any data. Some of the other motorcycles made by European brands in India, specifically single-cylinder ones like KTM and BMW, this bike feels like a half step toward a single-cylinder Honda that's built in Thailand. And I'm not saying that Thai-built Hondas are the gold standard, but if you did have that opinion, you might not be wrong. Those bikes have been shown to be very reliable. I do think they feel like Hondas, and I think that they've carried forth a little bit more of the company tone. The point is, I think this bike is a half step in the right direction. And I think it is a good first bike to lust after. I think there's a lot to lust after, from the looks of it, to the simplicity of it, to the feel of it. And I'm still not all the way sold on building down in this sort of global way that brands have started doing or have continued doing in the past few years. But it kind of is what it is. And I hope the good ones rise to the top, because that's ultimately what we need to create ongoing quality in the motorcycling world. So I hope you do lust after this bike. I hope you get one, and I hope you join us in the two-wheeled world. In the meantime, let's put the sucker on the Daily Rider leaderboard, shall we? Stick with me. Hang on.
Hug it out, everybody. Inside RevZilla West and the Daily Rider leaderboard, we've got a Triumph Speed 400 ready to go on the board. Friendly reminder of what's at the top: BMW R1300 GS, KTM 890 SMT, and KTM 1390 Super Duke. None of the top motorcycles are budget motorcycles like the Speed 400, and for that reason, I don't think we're going to see it, disrupt the top of the leaderboard. But where does it fall? A more likely place to look, of course, would be down here. KTM 390 Duke. Let's start there. Triumph Speed 400 is less sophisticated in many ways. It doesn't have as many adjustments for ride modes and traction control, and it doesn't have as much adjustability in the suspension, the levers, stuff like that we talked about on the ride. And I think the KTM 390 Duke deserves a lot of credit for having all of those features. At the end of the day, though, I think the Speed 400 fits the part a little bit better. I like the feel of the bike a little bit better. It inspires more confidence and direction based on what the bike is supposed to be. If you want the sort of like hottest, gnarliest, kind of most aggressive, lightest, performance-oriented bike in the category, then I think maybe the 390 Duke is that. But I like this bike better. I think it's a better machine ultimately. The same kind of goes for the RS457. I think that's a pretty good bike. I like the engine a lot in that bike, the little 270-degree parallel twin that's in the Aprilia RS457 is a cool engine. I like the way it sounds, I like the way it feels, but it was flawed in some ways that the Speed 400 is not, in my opinion. So I think I'm gonna go above those bikes. Now we get into the Japanese machines, the Kawasaki Ninja 500 SE, Honda SEL 500. Obviously the Speed 400 matches up much more directly with the SEL 500. The Honda SEL 500 is more of a new age retro, if you will. It's got this sort of weird multi-eye headlight, and ultimately it's a Honda Rebel that's been adapted to be a sort of scrambler, not a cut from whole cloth iteration of a motorcycle like the Speed 400 is. So from that standpoint, I like the Speed 400 better. I think the aesthetic is more put together. I think it looks more the part. Its stature is better. It's got better kickstand presence. I was gonna say that the Speed 400 just doesn't quite deliver the same way the SEL does, because the SEL's got a bigger engine that's a little bit more adept, I think, and it's so sweet, and the transmission is good, and the brakes are fine on the SEL 500. The sort of basic stuff is good. This is tricky. I'm throwing myself a little curveball. I thought it was going to land here, but now I'm thinking maybe it goes above the SEL 500. The Speed 400 is better than the SEL 500 in a lot of ways. And if you buy the Speed 400 because you think it looks better, because you like the size a little bit better, I would have to get behind you. I'd have to be like, yeah, sure, that's fine. But if they're sitting next to each other in my garage, as much as I dislike the dash on this bike and I dislike the stock seat, I might splurge the extra $68 or whatever it is for the aftermarket seat, just to be a little bit more comfortable. And I think I would lean toward that Honda 500 platform. I just think it's too good. I think this bike is too solid and nicely built. Even if the Speed 400 is sexier and like aesthetically a lot more pleasing, I think this is the machine that I would lean toward. In this case, if you disagree with my assessment of where the Speed 400 lands on the Daily Rider leaderboard, fair enough, I say. I hope that won't keep you from watching Daily Rider again in the future. Stay tuned here. We have a couple of fun episodes coming up next, episode 99 and 100. I won't give away too much, but I've been working hard on something special for the Daily Rider audience. Thanks so much for hanging out on another ride. I appreciate it. Ride safe. See you next time.
Go through this long corner. I really like, ooh, cement truck. I really like this corner. Excellent. Just another